Okay, everybody. We'll go ahead and get this show on the road. The 5th meeting of the Labor Force Participation Task Force. So if you've been on previous ones, you're familiar with me, Brian Grady, Erica Von Essen, Nina Staggers, who's our Assistant Executive Director of Workforce Development, and we also have in the room William Floyd, who is the agency's Chief of Staff. So if you want to say a few words about yourself.
It's great to be here. I appreciate this opportunity to listen in. Thank you all for what you're doing.
Okay. So the main item on the agenda today is the presentation of our the second research deliverable that was commissioned by DO as a result of the work of this task force back in the spring. So Chris Chmura and her team will go ahead and give an overview of their findings, and then after that, Nina will lead a discussion about next steps. So Chris, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Let me show my screen. So can you see that big orange screen? Yes. Okay. Thank you. All right. Thanks for the opportunity to make this presentation today and to work with you on this project. Joining me today is Shabin Shwai, a senior economist of ours and director of research, and then Patrick Clapp, who's an economist. So insights here, what we'll do first is look at historical trends, basically one slide, and then we'll break it out between 2 time periods in terms of the literature review and all the work that we do here, the pre-COVID and then the COVID. We'll give you some high-level findings. You've all gotten a copy of the report. Hopefully you've been able to take a look at it. In terms of the literature review, then decomposition, South Carolina analysis, and then industry analysis. So wrapping that up with potential policies. So first, here's the whole issue and why we're doing this work and why the state has done the survey and then asked us to do the literature review and some industry analysis. When you look at South Carolina's participation rate, it started to diverge in 1994, while the U.S. Went down some, but not nearly as much. So the question is, why did this happen? And are there any things that South Carolina can do in terms of policies to try to lift that participation rate back up, especially with all the growth that they're seeing right now, particularly in manufacturing in the Greenville area and in the Charleston area? So the literature review, no surprise, pre-COVID, aging population made up most of the decrease. Since 2000, studies have shown that the aging population contributed about 2/3 of the drop from 61.1 to 63.3 in 2013. When we look at young adults, the decrease in their participation rate was due to increased school enrollment, maybe more school intensity, that is spending more time with schoolwork instead of having part-time jobs, and also increased leisure activity was identified in some of the studies. Among men, the globalization, so the offshoring, the loss of manufacturing jobs that we saw, also an increase in disabilities and addictions also led to some of the decrease in participation rate. And then among women, increased educational attainment and caregiving were the main drivers of their lower participation rate. And this is for the nation overall, of course, in these studies. When we look at the literature review of COVID through the current time, the increased household income from stimulus checks and the expanded unemployment benefits. Now, some of that is gone, but some of that allowed people to work from home. And so you would expect, as we get further away from those stimulus checks having been given to households, that we'll see more people starting to work. But in fact, just a couple of days ago, I heard one of the large bank presidents talk about how deposits were still a little bit on the elevated side from what they typically would see. But his guess was that by the time we get to mid next year, those deposits will be back toward more normal deposit levels. So you have shifts in worker preferences away from low-skilled and customer-facing jobs. And again, during this period where people were told to work from home, they had stimulus checks. Some of them were able to get training to go into alternative occupations. and we saw some degree of new equipment and things being put in place so that, for example, at the McDonald's restaurants, you don't have to go up to the counter to order, but you go to the kiosk in order. So these this new ways of doing business to reduce the number of workers needed, also leading to lower participation. Early retirement is a reason why, since COVID in particular, we've seen the participation rate stay lower. And then the deaths caused by COVID, of course, reduced the number of people that were working. And then this last one we've been getting more information on it over the last year or two is the long COVID. People who get COVID and then typically they have other factors that are issues, and they become disabled and they're unable to work. So all of these things have exacerbated the decline in the participation rate since COVID. And then finally, increasing focus on the need to care for family members, including children. And of course, once kids were able to go back to school, that lifted a bit, but still is an issue based on some reports. So now turning to Xiaobing for the decomposition analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. As Chris mentioned, we try to figure out what are some of the key drivers that driving the changes in the South Carolina's labor force participation rates. And we realized that the recent changes in the labor force participation is driven heavily by the COVID. So as Chris mentioned, so we decided to do all those analysis by 2 time period. One is from 1994 to 2019 before COVID. Then we do the same analysis just from 2019 to 2021. So to see what is the factors driving the changes in the labor force participation during the COVID. So the purpose of this decomposition analysis is that, for example, in these charts, you see that labor force participation rate in South Carolina dropped from 67.3% in 1994 to 58.8% in 2019. So that is the 8.5 percentage point decline. So the first question is that what drives those decline? And we hear a lot of people talking about the population aging. And as Chris mentioned in literature review, a lot of studies has also concluded that the population aging is a key drivers of the population of the labor force participation rate decline. But outside the population aging, are there any changes within each of the demographic group that might contribute to the decline in the labor force participation rates? So that is the purpose of this decomposition, is that we look at the segregated the population into different demographic groups. In this case, we did the 2 analysis. One is age group, the other is education group. So we're using a decomposition model to figure out how much of those decline are caused by the changes in the population share or the population aging, and how much of this change is caused by changes in the labor force participation rates within each demographic group. So next slide, please. So the first, we look at the results from the decomposition analysis with the age group. So in this case, we segregate the population into different age groups: young workers, prime age workers, and older workers. Then we look at how much the changes in the within group and between group changes contributed to the changes in the labor force participation rates. So first, for example, in the first orange bar, we listed 8.7% percentage changes. That means is that we keep the within group labor force participation rate, such as young population, prime age group labor force participation rates at the 1994 level, and only change the population share at the 2019. So that gave us the 8.7% changes in labor force participation rates, actually more than the 8.5% change overall. That means that the changes in the population share or the aging population actually contributed to more than 100% of the overall changes in labor force participation rates. Because, but then there's other changes in the within group labor force participation rates that actually offset some of those changes. So in the end, we see a 8.5 percentage point decline in the labor force participation rates. Next slide, please. So we're going to share some of the top 3 factors that are contributing to the labor force participation rate decline. The first, obviously, it's the aging population. The increasing share of the population 65 and older actually contributed to the more than 70% of the decline in the labor force participation rates. So this is higher than some of the national study Chris mentioned, about 2/3 of the decline attributed to the population aging. Then the second factor is the decline in the young population labor force participation rate. This is the decline in the labor force participation within the younger population group. And then the third factor is the decline in the share of the prime age population. So first you have the, so in this aging population share, you first have the increase in the older population, but you also have the decrease in the prime age population that combined contributed, explained a large part of the decline in the labor force participation rates in the South Carolina. So also another some of the interesting finding is that there are young and prime age population, their labor force participation rate declined. That is also helped to explain some of the decline in the overall population. Then actually the labor force participation rates for older groups actually increased, but that's not enough to offset the large increase in their population share. One of the exercise we do is also compare South Carolina with neighboring states of North Carolina and Georgia. We find out that for other states, also aging population explained a large part of their decline in the labor force participation rates, but to a lesser degree than the South Carolina. So it feels like South Carolina was affected more by the aging population than some of the neighboring states. Next slide, please.
Okay. And any questions to this point? I know this is decomposition is not a really straightforward, easy to understand concept.
I have a question if you don't mind. I think I understand the decomposition. I probably was asking for this more than anyone. I guess there's like maybe two different ways that I was thinking about the decomposition. So from the first graph that you showed kind of highlighted the problem of, just the US versus South Carolina graph is where there's a decline in both the US and South Carolina. I think these decompositions are kind of doing a good job answering what happens to explain the decline in South Carolina. And then I guess another decomposition you could do is just like in 2019, why is the South Carolina lower than the United States? So is it actually like differential aging? I guess, part of this is I think you do the close states decomposition, but there you're still looking over time. You can do the same decomposition at one time across the two groups, I think. And so it might be interesting to just say, like, it seems like, both from the literature review and the within state, I think it's fair to conclude that it seems like these population demographics and aging are accounting for most of the declines that we're seeing. But then is it true also that the differential between South Carolina and the US as a whole is due to differential aging in South Carolina Or is there, different educational patterns in South Carolina or those other things? And I'm not sure we're fully convinced on the latter based on the evidence. But maybe
Right,
you've
so-
done that other decomposition.
Yeah, we have not done that, but that's the interesting perspective, interesting thought. But I think we did. I think Patrick will talk about in the end. We did do a kind of cross-sectional regression, so that try to account for different factors at this moment of different states in terms of demographics and age and industry mix. I think he will talk more about that. That probably can partially address some of your questions. Then the next exercise we do is to look at the changes in educational attainment and how that affected or contributed to the changes in the labor force participation rates from 94 to 2019. So in this exercise, we segregate the population into different educational groups: those without high school diploma, high school graduates, some college, and the bachelor's degree and above. So there is both positive and negative about it. I think the negative conclusion we get is that in all of those educational groups, the within group labor force participation rate declined. Actually, they accounted for 13.7 percentage point decline in the overall labor force participation rates decline. But the good news is that overall the educational attainment in South Carolina is improving, and since typically the groups with high educational levels, for example, college graduates usually have a higher labor force participation rates than high school graduates. Because of the improving educational attainment, more and more individuals are moving to the higher educational groups. That actually increased the overall labor force participation rate in the state by 5.5 percentage point. So overall, the decline is still 8.5 percentage point, but improving educational attainment actually increased play a positive role in preventing a more worsening decline in the labor force participation rates. Yeah. Next, we did the same analysis for the between 2019 and 2021 to see whether the pattern changed during the COVID. So I think the pattern did change during the COVID. Obviously, the population aging still play a role, but much a smaller role. So overall, we see the labor force participation rate decline by 2.2 percentage point. Less than half of those are caused by the continuous population aging, but then 1.2 percentage point decline are caused by the within group decline in the labor force participation rates. Like Chris mentioned, across all educational groups, people are fear of infection, and people also, they all get the stimulus check. And so those are actually account for more than half of the net decline in the labor force participation rate during the COVID. So we see some different patterns here. Excellent. Yeah, so in this case, the top three factors, two of them are actually within group changes. So for example, decreasing labor force participation rates for population 65 and older contributed to the largest decline. And Chris mentioned in literature review, a lot of people taking early retirement for these older education groups. And so they actually drive a lot of these declines. Then there's also decline in the labor force participation rate of prime age population, also contributed to the 22% of the overall decline. But the second top three factor is the continuous population aging. Increased population share of those 65 also contributed to the decline. So those are the top three factors. And we also compare with some of the other states, and they are similar. In this case, but all the 3 states have a similar type of decomposition results. Next slide. Finally, this is the decomposition during COVID based on the educational attainment. So in this case, since there is limited changes in the educational attainment in the last 2 years, so almost all the decline in the labor force participation rate at the state level can be explained by the decline in the labor force participation rate within each educational subgroup. So I think that's it. I'll hand up to Patrick, unless there are some more questions.
Can I ask a question really quickly? So at the beginning, Chris, you covered kind of these factors that were impacting labor force participation pre-COVID and then those that affect it during COVID. One of the things we've been talking about a lot too at the Fed is that some of those pre-COVID things likely just got worse, right? So like drug addiction got worse, mental health got worse. This maybe malaise that non-college educated white men were feeling got worse. I didn't really see much talk about that because it does seem like some of the groups, even with what we were just covering there, that saw continued declines were the same groups that were seeing declines pre-COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And Patrick and Shavin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember seeing any studies that said these trends just kind of accelerated. But that's something we all. Although COVID was not, COVID had a recession in it, but it was not your typical recession.
Right.
But recessions typically accelerate trends.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, it makes sense. But again, I didn't see any studies that that actually measured that.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
Fair
good
enough.
point.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Is there a reason you ran these separately rather than just all together as one group? I mean, I guess you could just bin the data by education, by age groups, and then run it all
Yeah, then it will.
together.
Yes, run them together. We did try that, but then there would be it's very difficult to see a pattern because you have a 4x4 4 group by 4 like 8 different groups. Then the interaction effect would be too much to see any kind of see a patterns basically. So we decided to simplify it. Run it separate rather than combined.
Can I ask one other? This is maybe too much in the rabbit hole for into the methodology, but I get you can do these decompositions just with like a shift share analysis that's an exact decomposition rather than running the regression with the interaction terms. So you just like hold the mean of each group fixed and then do the shifts. And so if you have a lot of groups, I guess
right.
it's possible. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know if there's a deep, I mean, maybe it's just like my simple brain kind of prefers the exact decomposition. But I don't know if there's a good reason to run it with the interactions.
Yeah, I think the thing is that it would be difficult to interpret the results because when you see a population aging, that's a very interesting thing. But when you cross it with the education, then you will see that it's just hard to see the aging happened because of the 4 different groups. So you might have the some of the education attainment changes for certain group, not the others.
Yeah.
So
I guess the other decomposition, I guess, would answer the question. If you do it without the interactions, you're asking, is the change due to changes within the groups or changes between the groups that are explaining, that are kind of explaining the observed changes that you see? And so if most of the changes are between the groups, then you say, well, it's just these demographic patterns and changing education kind of accounts for all of the differences. But then if it's within the groups, then we start to worry, well, if like prime aged men are working less, then there was like maybe there's some policy lever
Yeah.
that we could change more. I guess is kind of the counterfactual that I was thinking. And I guess and then there's two of them. There's this overtime, and then there's the South Carolina versus the United States. Is how I was trying to
Right. Yeah.
through this.
I completely see your point, but then it's like you instead of talking about older workers, you were talking about older workers with high school degree, older workers with college degree, older workers with without high school diploma. So we're basically talking about 16 different groups, and just each group might. I guess my concern is that it's hard to get some key messages out of it.
Yeah, no, I think the clarity of the graphs that you provide are really nice to show like how much of it is driven by these changes in education. It's just
I do want to just jump in quick to clarify. We didn't run a regression with interaction terms. I think we did do it the way that you were talking about, with holding a mean constant. Is that right, Xiaobing?
Yeah, that's correct. So that it's not the regression, it's the holding mean constant, holding population share constant.
Similar to that chip share.
Yeah, we have the paper listed in the report, so that's where we get our methodology.
Cool. Sorry for going into like the technical weeds.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. Good questions. Patrick, regional analysis?
All right, if we're ready to go, yeah. So far we've looked a lot at the statewide level, but of course there's significant differences across the state. This is a map from the American Community Survey data, 5-year 2016 to 2020. So including some of the COVID data, but also letting us get to some of this detail. And the darker colors here are going to be areas with higher participation rates, with the darkest is over 64%. And as you get progressively lighter, see fewer and fewer people and smaller percentages of the populations participating in those areas. So we can see a pretty wide variation here, down to 36.6% in McCormick, off on the middle left there, and up to 65-66% in York, near benefiting from the proximity to Charlotte there, and Charleston. So the distribution and the differences in participation rates, particularly around more urban areas and rural areas across the state, suggest that there should be maybe some differences in who's not participating there, and different policies that we might want to look at in addressing that. So on the next slide, we broke up the state by county into 2 areas for analysis, rural and urban. And there's some issues, particularly in South Carolina, with defining urban as a metro area. There's still some pretty rural counties included within that. So we took some guidance from another paper and looked at counties with a population density of 155 people per square mile or less to be our rural area. And again, using the ACS data here, we took a look at the difference in labor force participation rates between these rural and urban counties, and ranked it by the biggest differences here. So right off the top, men in rural areas are participating at much lower rates. If you look at the difference between about 70% versus 80-ish%, you got a 10.3 percentage point difference, suggesting some really different experiences for men in these areas. Other top differences here, Black and African American, also about 10 percentage point differences. With a disability is significant here, with much lower percentages participating in the rural areas. And we also did regression analysis of some of these factors to try and get at some of the significant factors in rural areas. And the percentage of the population with a disability was really a standout in terms of significant explanatory power for a lot of the lower participation, especially in rural areas. Hispanic and Latino also have a high difference in participation. And we've talked a little bit about the increased participation opportunities that education can open up people with less than a high school diploma or equivalent, showing a large difference there, with less than half participating in rural areas. We're also looking at maybe earlier retirements or possibly related to the disability of 45 to 54-year-olds have a higher participation rate difference. Overall, the difference between rural and urban areas is 8.4 percentage points.
Do you have a mix? Do you have a percentage of population over 65 for rural versus urban?
Yes, the full report has even more on page 31. So I pulled out just for this presentation anything above the overall difference in participation.
I wasn't talking about really participation, but just for the population that was looked at, what's the percentage of people over 65 who live in rural versus the percentage over 65 live in urban?
No, I didn't look at that specifically.
Yeah, I was just wondering how much could be explained by people just kind of moving away from the cities and out into the countryside. I don't know if it's a thing. I'm just wondering if that could account, guys. I'm just starting to break down some of these things. I'm like, just I could see people who kind of retiring with disability or some of these things. But I get the 45 to 54, but I was just wondering about the overall sample as well. Cool, thanks.
Any other questions? Nope. So going back to this, the industry analysis, Chris, you can go ahead.
Okay.
Going back to this very first slide, just to refresh your memory about the trends that we're looking at, where South Carolina participation more or less tracked with the nation until about 1994 and broke off. We wanted to look at comparing those neighboring states again in North Carolina and Georgia. Did they see a similar break? And some of the literature review also suggested globalization and changing employment in industries might be a factor. So we wanted to dig into that a little bit more. On the next slide, we've got South Carolina in green here, Georgia in orange, North Carolina in purple. You can see South Carolina starting to decline at a faster rate in terms of participation, again in 1994, but not really a similar divergence in Georgia and North Carolina. Definitely some declines. The aging population, as suggested in the national studies, is a factor across all of these states, but not to the same extent. So wanted to dig into industries a little bit more. And on the next slide, we looked at manufacturing just at the sector level. And when we index the employment growth here, it really jumps out. Overall, South Carolina and the US, total employment grew at about the same rate. So the index here means that in 2001, overall employment was about 15% higher than where it was in 94. Manufacturing grew a little bit in the US through 2000 and started declining then. But really, since 1994, broke off in South Carolina and declined at a much faster rate, down 14% over this period, from 94 to 2001. We can break out that manufacturing employment a little bit further on the next slide, and it really helps paint this picture. As we might expect with some of the globalization following NAFTA and what was going on in this period, if we break out the manufacturing industry at the 3-digit level, the textile mills jumps out right from the start here. It's that green line, almost 90,000 employment in 1990, declining, but decline really accelerated after 1994. The apparel manufacturing also is that black line, about 35,000, and similar sharp decline over this period. As employment in those manufacturing industries dropped out, there really was not employment in other manufacturing available for those workers to move through. So in purple, you can see some of the growth in transportation equipment manufacturing, and particularly in recent years. It's really accelerated, but nowhere near, even with the recent growth, nowhere near close to replacing the about 100,000 jobs lost between the textile mills and apparel manufacturing between 1990 and 2010.
So is the thought here that you end up with almost like a zombie population where people lose their jobs, and instead of kind of finding something else, they engage and disengage, maybe seasonal retail work or other things, but at any given time, they're just not as fully engaged as before? Like, I'm wondering, was there any out migration after these plants shut down, or just people kind of hang out and whatever happened, happened?
Yeah, that's a good point on the zombie. And I don't even know that they even came and left. But if you think about the occupations and the skill set of textile worker, knitting, weaving machine setter, there's not a lot of other occupations they can go into. I think when we were doing some analysis, because we saw that in Virginia as well, and actually to some degree in North Carolina, one of the occupations that was transferable is testers and sorters, but there wasn't a lot of growth in firms needing testers and sorters in South Carolina at this point in time. So my guess, and I just as background, went to school at Clemson, so near Greenville, where we saw a lot of loss in jobs. When I first started at the Fed in the early 1980s, North Carolina and South Carolina, and this shocked me, had the largest percentage of manufacturing jobs of any state in the nation. More so than Michigan or Ohio, which is more where I'm from. So yeah, it's the theory that we hadn't, I think we have some evidence here, but we don't have absolute evidence, is that a lot of these individuals weren't able to find jobs. They just dropped out of the workforce. And if they were 50 years old when they dropped out, or if they were 30 or 40 years old, or 20 years later, they're near retirement and not looking for work.
It's interesting because when you drive through, it's if you get off the highway and you go over towards like Myrtle Beach and stuff, you just see the remnants. And it's the thing that I think we all wondered when you do drive around is, are these just people who just have hung on literally for like 15, 20 years and just like, it's not worth it, don't have the savings to perhaps move. And so they just, like I say, become almost kind of like a zombie population. But this is really interesting. This is very, very fascinating to see that this could be something that haunts, I think, a lot of these rural areas that used to have these kind of plants and such in them, that the people kind of stayed, but the jobs went.
One thing from an anecdotal standpoint, when you see the gaps that are filled in other areas like advanced manufacturing with BMW coming through, you see on the I-85 interstate corridor, as well as down in Charleston, you see the plug gaps, and those are where the urban city counties have grown back up, or you see that trend back up. But then if you go into, Clarendon County, Lee County, I-95 corridor, you see a lot of the remnants of the smaller towns that are also the part of the clusters with regards to that textile manufacturing with the gens. I mean, you walk around and see all the towns and the little towns where there's no more gens because they're not producing the cotton that goes into the textile manufacturer. So it's all centered around where that rural community had those layers and may have some, production capacity on the very basis front part changing into the agriculture. So it's very fascinating because it's kind of linked back into that whole superstructure to some extent.
Good point.
Just in going back to these, like comparing other states, is it like if you look at North Carolina, does this pattern look similar? You said you had looked at that. And that, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to put a story to this. And I guess one story is that if you're in a city and you're doing manufacturing, then there's other jobs in that
Mhm.
city. But if you're in this small town that is just, and I guess a lot of the South Carolina manufacturing, at least in the upstate, were these little mills or these little, little things that there was a town centered around that. Now you can drive around and the downtowns are still nice. They're old brick buildings, but then it's also kind of sad because there's nothing there anymore.
Yeah,
So-
so just, yeah, good point. So, Patrick will address this in a minute with another regression he did, but if you think about it, we're comparing it to Georgia and we're comparing it to North Carolina. And think about those two states, what you know now, and also what we knew back in the 1990s. In the 1990s, Georgia, it had defense firms, aerospace was big. And so even though it was losing jobs in some of the textile, furniture, the traditional manufacturing that was going away, they were seeing good growth because of the defense industry, because of aerospace. And then if you think about North Carolina, it also was losing jobs in these traditional furniture, textile and apparel, but it had some growing industries, specifically pharmaceutical is really big there. And they're more known for high tech. For example, they got Dell Computer expanded there maybe 15 years ago, even though as soon as their incentive ran out, they left North Carolina and went overseas. But so the research triangle was attracting a lot of manufacturing. So, but in
But
South
it's like,
Carolina,
the furniture stuff, was that already in cities? And so it was like people were losing jobs, and because it's like these bigger plants and high tech things are kind of at least near urban centers to some degree, where so it was like, I don't know, I'm kind of fairly new to South Carolina, so I don't know if, like, was furniture manufacturing that was being lost already sort of more urban than the South Carolina. And I guess there's like the NAFTA shock and the China shock that we all talk about decimating these occupations. And then now we're trying to tease out differential effects from that, I guess.
yeah, a question about the urban in North Carolina, maybe our Fed friend do you have any more insight on that?
She might not be.
I do know
from.
I was going to mention that, in the furniture there in North Carolina and Hickory and the surrounding areas, they've seen such a shock, but it's more of a China, production, capacity thing, and then the offset of offshoring. But then they've also, in the recent years, have gotten other types of aerospace, Toyota, new EV battery center. So
Yeah.
it's very, very similar to Greenville Spartanburg, but in those rural areas, there was a differential between what was the product of that area. It's like the whole county or that one small rural area. And that's why I think in South Carolina, like the whole community were surrounded around that one industry model is a little bit more diversified. Now you see that in some parts, Eastern North Carolina, North Carolina and whatnot, but in some of those city areas. Plus, from a population standpoint, if you look at the demographics of North Carolina versus South Carolina, there's a lot more density within those city environments versus more rural across the state. And South Carolina is becoming more and more urban, but in some places it's a lot more rural in those smaller counties. So I think the jobs are something that's popping out to me is like there's not many jobs in those areas, and we looked at decisions of making a decision to go into work. There's just not a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, let me actually answer this also, because I was just looking across the country. Employment in furniture actually did incredibly well from 94 till 2000. So the collapse in furniture didn't occur until the early 2000s. So, and I think by that point, North Carolina had really done a good job of attracting tech and finance, a lot of pharma, like they all had been coming in pretty strong at that point. I think that this literally is just, they had diversified because they knew tobacco was waning and they knew that furniture was probably had its days. So they just did a really good job, I think, of diversifying out.
Great discussion. Thank you. And anything else, or Patrick?
I'll just mention that we do have some literature review in the regional analysis that supports some of what was stated about the when the rural area experiences a negative employment shock, that it causes higher unemployment rates and more extended, longer unemployment as people have more trouble finding those opportunities for additional work. So we've got some support for that in the report as well. As one last regression here, we pulled over some of the significant variables from the regional analysis that we did, and also wanted to try and focus in on this question of the industry mix contribution to labor force participation rates. We, based on what we looked at and what's been growing or declining over this period, picked out a few significant ones. Of course, textile and apparel manufacturing is very important here, and what we're looking at. We also looked at transportation, warehousing, professional, scientific, and technical, healthcare, accommodation, and pharmaceutical manufacturing and printing as sectors that, when we look at, based on the data availability, the 2001 to 2019 period, and try and avoid some of those COVID factors here, but looking at the change in employment in those industries and how those might contribute. So we've got the coefficients from the regression analysis here, and then the table is also showing the values for South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. So to look at the male percentage of the population, for example, the South Carolina has a slightly lower percentage of the population that's male, about 0.1 percentage point. This is something that had a significant effect on labor force participation rate, on increasing it in particular. So the slightly lower population in South Carolina is contributing to a lower labor force participation rate overall. The population with a disability again showed up significantly here, and with over 12% of the population in South Carolina with a disability, that's going to contribute. And when we get into some of the industry mix, we do see some good support for industries like transportation and warehousing and accommodation and food services, and the different, some slower growth in South Carolina, maybe on or similar to Georgia growth here, maybe could actually be helping raise some of the participation. I think this transportation and warehousing could be tied to where they're locating in some of the more rural areas as well, and why we see a negative effect on participation associated with that. Slower growth also in the accommodation and food services over this period, as providing fewer opportunities and related to a lower labor force participation rate. And we did see some, at least weak significance of the textile and apparel manufacturing, which had a greater decline in South Carolina compared to Georgia, but actually not North Carolina. North Carolina actually declined further during this period than South Carolina. In all of these cases, it's contributing to the lower labor force participation rate. But as we were just discussing, North Carolina had taken some diversification steps, had seen growth, particularly in pharmaceutical manufacturing and more employment and opportunities in food manufacturing as well, which could help offset some of the impact of these declines on participation. I think that's the end of the regional and industry analysis. Were there any additional questions?
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Oh,
So I was just
Sorry.
going to say real quick, the percentage of population with a bachelor's degree is definitely much lower in South Carolina versus Georgia and North Carolina. That's also highly correlated to higher unemployment rates, but just I think these things are all blended together. It really does, the story does kind of emerge out of here from what you've shown and kind of knowing some of the things about demographics.
Thank you. Okay, policy recommendations, some from the literature, improving labor force reentry for former prisoners. We'll go through that a little more in the next slide. Expand policies that help people balance employment and caregiving. And of course, we've especially seen that some policies with regard to daycare that some states are implementing, or even some governments around the globe. Support transportation projects that connect workers in rural areas to urban areas, of course, to give them more opportunities than they have in the rural areas. Increase work flexibility by promoting work from home. And of course, the state can't mandate that companies allow their workers to work from home, but certainly the state can allow their workers, those that can, to work remotely, and that may help bring in more people, especially in rural areas, into the workforce. Add programs for the needs of youth who aren't in school and aren't working, for them to develop soft skills, and also help them get into the lower skilled jobs that have career paths, identify those. And then strengthen guidance and coursework connected to in-demand careers in middle school and high school. We're seeing a lot of states and localities doing more of that, making sure that the schools are training kids for in-demand occupations, and then also encouraging employers to offer things like paid internships and job shadowing to help get kids interested in the workforce. And then there are some existing policies or lack of policies that likely negatively impact the labor force participation. So early retirement and large disability assistance can encourage some older workers to permanently exit the workforce. And of course, COVID was a great experiment on that. That is, all the money that was given to individuals during COVID gave us the opportunity to see that, yes, some individuals would rather not come back to the workforce if they have the funding coming from someplace else. Restrictive hiring of formerly incarcerated individuals or barring them from certain licenses reduces the potential workforce. Addressing the lack of family-friendly policies can increase participation for 25 through 44 age group of women. And again, a big one there would be daycare center, either given credits or subsidies. And even some private sector employers, of course, are doing that to try to increase the number of workers that they have in their own establishments. And then, of course, we all went over the survey, it seems like it was about a month ago, the review of the labor, we reviewed the labor participation survey and added a few things here. And just as a reminder, so the state's broken up into tiers where businesses receive tax credits based on the unemployment rate. So the more distressed regions get bigger tax credits for job creation. Tier 4 would be the most distressed. Tier 1, the least, or the best performing. So Tier 4 are generally low-income rural counties, so they lack transportation as the main barrier to employment, is what the survey found, and is consistent with some things I think we found here in the literature review. And then those regions, Tier 4 regions, can focus on low cost and accessible transportation projects to connect workers. And again, during these tight times, we've heard even of businesses, warehouses in particular, doing that, having buses that will go to the rural areas and bring the workers to their warehouse or the jobs. There are informational barriers to the Tier 4 counties, according to the survey. And so again, to bridge that gap is to have the local workforce organizations increase the marketing for available jobs, maybe have some websites to make that available, make sure the workforce centers are strategically located so that the job seekers can go there. If so, rural area that's vast, maybe coordinated with other centers such as libraries to share this job opportunity information. Tier 2 counties the survey found that family-friendly policies should be explored to increase labor force participation. And then finally, tier 3 counties, there's a relatively larger center of retirees. And so policies perhaps around how to targeting those retirees to incentivize them to come back to the workforce. So that is an overview of the report that we provided. Here's a summary, I should say. And with that, I will turn it back over or see if there are any final questions.
Thank you, Chris. And I did want to let everyone know we've had a couple of different versions, so we will send out the most recent version of the report to you this afternoon. Make sure you have a copy of all of that. And then at the conclusion of this meeting, we'll get this the slides posted as well as a recording of the meeting on the main site. So if there are no final questions, I would like to ask Nina to talk a little bit about some of the next steps that we're thinking as we move to the end of this year and thinking about next year.
Thank you, Erica. So we've been discussing how to move the task force forward and how to make sure that all of this great information gets out to stakeholders in South Carolina and the public that's very interested in hearing the results of this work. And so we've tentatively planned some stakeholder briefing sessions to happen at the end of January and into the first part of February, so that this information that's coming out of the task force can be shared with others in our state that are very interested to hear the results. I think there will probably be some other states that are also interested to hear what South Carolina has learned. We'd like to convene the task force for a final meeting in late February, early March to just wrap up the accomplishments of the group, as well as to put forth a recommendation to you all in terms of what we see as being phase 2 of the task force. And we've talked about some recommendations coming out of both the survey as well as the research project, but we're really thinking that phase 2 is going to include a lot of the partners and stakeholders that would be invested in things like childcare and transportation and hiring offenders, and getting those folks to participate in phase 2 and really spend some time coming up with actionable strategies and recommendations for how to help address and increase labor force participation. And we're expecting that that will probably launch toward the end of spring. So I would think April, May timeframe of 2023. Before we close out, I'll just see if there are any final questions about either the research or what we see as the next phase of the task force. All right, well, hearing none, have a very happy holiday, and we should have a scheduling poll out, I would think, to everyone in January to schedule that final meeting of phase 1 of the task force for February.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.